Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, November 15th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Arizona, a governor's race that is set to take place next November that will be quite indicative and quite helpful in our understanding of how swing states are likely to vote in the next presidential election, what Democrats and Republicans are doing well in each state, and given that this is a state that in the last presidential cycle voted for Donald Trump over Vice President Kamala Harris by roughly 6 percentage points, will be a great state to analyze and understand why voters are voting the way they do and what we can take from it for 2028 and potentially beyond. And the reason why I'm making this video is because I actually came across a brand new poll from Emerson College. Now, they do a lot of great polling, and I love to uplift it, especially since I'm living in Boston, and they do these polls directly from the Boston campus, and so huge fan of that. But also not to mention that Emerson, save the New Jersey governor's race this year, has been remarkably right in many of these races. They were the only pollster that nailed the New York City mayoral election in on the Democratic side in that primary that took place in June, and also to what we're looking at in this governor's race in Arizona. They do a lot of the races that we oftentimes won't see any real and nonpartisan polling until months before the election. And so they've done an Arizona 2026 race, and the takeaways from it have actually not changed too tremendously from the last time we talked about this governor's race, which was arguably, not too different in terms of national circumstance, but Democrats are now doing a lot better when it comes down to the generic ballot. They're doing a lot better when it comes down to actual election results. At that time we talked about Arizona, probably around August, Democrats were still in that phase of special elections, giving them that overperformance boost. But now we've seen it concretely in Virginia, California, Georgia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, so on and so forth. And looking at Arizona, the question is, will Democrats see it again? But the headline here is that, yes, the race is always going to be a tight re-election. This is a state that in 2016 voted for Donald Trump by 3.5, in 2020 voted for Joe Biden by 0.2, and in 2024 voted for Donald Trump by 5, but on the same ballot voted for a Democrat by 3 on the Senate race. And so absolutely, it was always going to be a tight race, and the data does suggest that that is in fact the case. Right now, the matchups between anyone shows a pretty competitive race, save David Schweikert, who's coming in at third when it comes down to the gubernatorial elections polling data. And when it comes down to Katie Hobbs' favorability rating, it's not that impressive. But what strikes me as something that I think shows the GOP's vulnerability is the fact that Andy Biggs leads this GOP primary, and not even by a little bit. Donald Trump did a little bit of a cop-out when it came down, not a little bit, a very big cop-out when it came down to this GOP primary. You might think, okay, Andy Biggs, if you've seen his ads in Arizona, if you live in Phoenix, Tucson, wherever, you will know Andy Biggs has been endorsed by Donald Trump. It is something that has become a prominent part of his campaign, but you also might have seen that Karen Taylor Robson has made it a prominent part of her campaign as well. So you're thinking, okay, what in the world is happening? Is somebody lying? Well, no, nobody is lying. Andy Biggs is endorsed by Trump. Karen Taylor Robson is as well. David Schweikert, not really. I mean, he's not getting an endorsement from Trump. He's a bit more, he's worried about his reelection in the House, so he's opting to run for governor. But Andy Biggs and Karen Taylor Robson received a co-endorsement from Donald Trump. So the endorsements from the president are often the most important in the GOP primary, but when they happen for two candidates, they're not so great. They don't do so well in general elections. But also, if there's a co-endorsement, no one is going to see the direct benefit of either side. It's really just going to be a question of who can message on it better. But Andy Biggs isn't just leading by a little bit. He's been immensely popular across the state. He's been serving in Congress for quite some time, and he's a well-known name because he has made himself out to be a major player in the Arizona GOP politics on the partisan side. And so voters love Andy Biggs in the GOP primary, but they don't necessarily love him in the general election, and I'm not just talking about the Emerson College poll. Now, Andy Biggs is benefiting from the fact that he represents a district that is very solid for Donald Trump and the Republicans. He represents Arizona's 5th district, which in the last election, when we look at the results here, voted for Donald Trump by a margin here of roughly 20 points. But when I think and I see his margin here, well, Andy Biggs is roughly running even with Donald Trump, and it begs the question, makes me really think about Andy Biggs as a candidate in particular. Why is it that in a year where Republicans across the country, many of them, saw this opportunity to usher in Republicans doing what Democrats were expecting to win the House, they didn't. They were expecting to hold on to many races like the Senate race in Pennsylvania, and they didn't. And in Arizona, Andy Biggs is an incumbent who's been in this position. He's been representing this since 2016. He came in with Trump, and it looks like he's going to leave with him too. But when you take a look at this district, it made me think about the wins above replacement score from Split Ticket. They do this where they analyze, okay, essentially, how well did the Democrat do against you or the Republican do against the Democrat? And what does that show in terms of how much this district voted in either direction relative to what the expectations were, based off money, based off incumbency status, based off past election history? And what you found was that Andy Biggs, since he has come into office, has found that his opponents have consistently overperformed. Why? Because he's not as popular as you might think. He has benefited from the fact that his district is Republican, but more so that he has never faced a competitive re-election since he has come into office. In 2016, he won by 30 points. 2 years later, the margin narrows by 10. 2 years after that, it narrows even more. He gets drawn into a more substantial Republican district. Then it becomes about a 20-point margin twice over. But seriously speaking about, what this means for the Democrats in these races, and Andy Biggs is a particular candidate, is that I would not be super confident if the person leading my GOP primary against a Democratic incumbent who has a history of consistent overperformance relative to the polls, I kid you not, Katie Hobbs never led on the average after September 9th. That was the day the switch happened where it became a tie, and from September 9th, 2022 through the election, Kari Lake was expected to win, and she won. The Kari Lake finished leading in the polls by roughly 4 points statewide. But Katie Hobbs went on to win the state. Katie Hobbs is certainly a sleeper candidate, but Andy Biggs, I think, is someone who has never been tested statewide, and arguably for good reason. Because in his district alone, it is evident that voters know who he is and are willing to back the Democrat more because they do not like Andy Biggs as their representative. And anybody who knows the district in particular and knows his time in Arizona politics can tell you the reason he does so well in this GOP primary is not because he is the most electable, but rather because he is the one that is most concerned with partisan antics. And voters on the partisan primary side recognize it and love it. But if there's one thing I would never trust the Arizona Republican primary electorate to do, is to choose a winning candidate. Because when you take a look at their track record, it really isn't that great. In the Senate race in 2024, they ran Kari Lake. And on the GOP side, in that primary, it wasn't even a competitive race. Kari Lake won by 16 points. She would go on to lose on the same ballot that Donald Trump won statewide by 6. In 2022, they made the same mistake. Not only did they nominate a lackluster Republican, Blake Masters, who had never run statewide before, went on to lose a congressional bid, not just this one, but won 2 years later. But he ran statewide at the request and endorsement of Donald Trump and lost by 5. But the governor's race too, remember that name, Kari Lake? In 2022, she was also the Republican nominee for governor and lost statewide. In 2020, Joe Biden won the state by 0.2%, but a very namely important part of the 2020 Senate races was that Democrats, besides Georgia, were largely underperforming relative to Joe Biden. In Colorado, Hickenlooper won by 9, Biden won by 14. In New Mexico, Ben Ray Lujan won by 6, Joe Biden won by 10, right? In many of these states, in Michigan, Joe Biden won the state of Michigan by 3, Gary Peters won it by 1.7, right? When you take a look at these margins here, some examples otherwise. In Maine, Sarah Gideon underperformed Biden by about 15 points. You're going to see that this was happening, right? In Texas, John Cornyn defeated MJ Hager by a margin of 10 points. Donald Trump won the state by 5. But in Arizona, Martha McSally, who again was endorsed by Donald Trump and propped up, underperformed Donald Trump by roughly 2 points. Republicans can't afford to nominate a lackluster candidate in this state of Arizona, but yet they constantly and always do. I've actually been very fascinated at how profoundly Arizona's Republican primary electorate just consistently chooses the weakest candidates election after election. And what has been so interesting about it all is that the stakes of the races never really change. In 2022, they lost a statewide governor's race, and the reaction was to nominate that same candidate a year later for an arguably even more important and nationalized race for United States Senate, with a time where it was an open race. Right? I mean, you were talking about 2024 was you had this race with Kyrsten Sinema, who flipped the race in 2018 against Martha McSally, who, might I add, Martha McSally is that same candidate who I just showed you lost in 2020. If her name rings a bell, it's because she ran in 2018 as well and lost. I mean, they cannot stop nominating losers in these races. And while Andy Biggs has had his enjoyable time in the House of Representatives, I want to caution, if this was to be, any type of political advice for the AZ GOP, Andy Biggs and Karen Taylor Robinson are not the people to win this race. And I don't know who really is. Kimberly Yee would have probably been the best and most phenomenal candidate there, but evidently she was pushed out of the race because she couldn't even crack 5% in the data because the primary electorate is so lopsided in choosing loyalty and choosing a Republican nominee who they feel much more comfortable with in actual governance rather than somebody who can win an election and who knows might surprise them in their time governing in office. And so I think that what this Emerson College poll exposes is exactly what we sort of knew was going to happen, right? When you take a look at what the numbers are telling us, is that Katie Hobbs is coming into this with an advantage. While it's not great, an advantage in a state that the President of the United States won by 6 in 2024. And a state that Democrats, with a national environment lopsided in their favor, can absolutely win that governor's race again. But I remember, and I think Republicans too in Arizona do as well, that governor race I covered not in 2022, but in 2018 in Arizona with Governor Doug Ducey running against David Garcia. Now, Governor Doug Ducey was first elected in 2014. In 2010, it had been a Republican before, Jan Brewer, but in 2014, based on term limits, Doug Ducey had to come in. If you don't know this about Doug Ducey, actually, if I'm wrong about this, I'm going to check right now, but I believe he owns the Cold Stone company. If I'm wrong about this, we'll find out. Yeah, so he was the CEO of the Cold Stone Creamery, which I'm a huge fan of their cotton candy flavor, by the way, if anyone was interested. But seriously, though, he ran in 2014 off his personal fortune, had obviously a lot of investment, won across the state in 2014, massive red wave year, but did so by less than his margin in 2018. And you have to ask why. Well, not only was Doug Ducey a strong candidate, but he also was a popular governor. Republicans in Arizona were willing to split their ticket voting for Doug Ducey for governor, but voting Kyrsten Sinema for U.S. Senate. Because the association with Donald Trump was what really tanked Republicans in this state historically. It was a state that in 2008 was overwhelmingly in favor of John McCain for obvious reason. He's from the state, but the Republicans won it, by 9 points in 2012. Mitt Romney won it by more. In 2004, it voted for George W. Bush by 11 points. In 2000, voted for George W. Bush by 6 points, right? In 96 was the last time a Democrat won it, and Bill Clinton did it with less than the majority of the vote and did so by 2.2%. And so it took 24 years later for Joe Biden to win Arizona, not by a majority, but by a narrow amount as well, though a much closer two-way race, I would argue, in Arizona than what you saw in 96 in a three-way race with Ross Perot back somehow running in this race again. But again, getting back to this point, Republicans were adored in Arizona until Donald Trump. And I don't want it to be lost in the plot that, Donald Trump winning this state in 2024 somehow means that it is out of reach for Democrats in 2026. Because this data shows that the vulnerable candidates here, and Andy Biggs, who I will say, what the war score tells me most is that voters who know him don't like him and are willing to be more inclined to vote for a Democrat for Congress, who I'm sure in many of these cases they don't know who it is, just to oppose Andy Biggs because he is unpopular and his name ID is actually quite low. Just 1 in 3, voters in Arizona have a favorable view. And roughly 1 in 3 don't even know who he is. And as Democrats get that opportunity to define him the same way they have in his district, chances are what makes him unpopular in AZ5 or wherever he is going to make him unpopular statewide as well. And I think that is really what we see happening here where, sure, everyone's losing to Katie Hobbs. But the question is, who has the highest reach here? Who has the best ability? I don't think any of these candidates in this race are going to be able to pull it off. But it certainly doesn't help when you are trying to, and when you're in a position where you need to be able to get the Democrats, Republicans rather, inspired, motivated, and turning out, and need to counteract and shift away from an unpopular president who in Arizona is unpopular based off the data that we see, is not a popular guy, which means that disassociation is a benefit. It's a plus. But in this data, you're not going to find it. You're not going to find it with the top 2 contenders who have a combined vote share of 67%. You're certainly not going to find it in the number 1 Trump guy who came into Congress at the same time as Donald Trump became president the first time in 2016. Andy Biggs was able to split that co-endorsement because Trump loves him. And that's it. And that is what I think will be his doom, because he's unpopular in his district, and I think he will be statewide as well. And what this data tells me is not only does Katie Hobbs start out with an advantage in a state that will be very indicative of the trend lines to come after the midterms, but also, too, that Republicans are already starting off with a disadvantage by choosing a candidate from the get-go who I adamantly believe has the least likely chance at winning the general election. And because Arizona is a swing state, it still may come. But to the degree that it is likely, certainly not. And Democrats start out as the advantage point, not just because of Katie Hobbs being popular or more liked than disliked, which is what this data point suggests, but also, too, because Andy Biggs is not the right guy for this moment. And yet Republicans flock to him easily, as we kind of expected. But to the degree that they are, really goes to show that this primary electorate really can't do much in terms of determining who can win. They like their candidates for a variety of reasons. But in terms of overall electability, the Arizona GOP has a horrible track record statewide. And chances are 2026 won't improve it a bit. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist from my 2026 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.